Hey guys, so yesterday we kind of introduced the idea of the endocrine system and what hormones are and what endocrine glands are. Today we're going to actually dive into some of those structures of the endocrine system and what they do and what hormones they produce and what those hormones do. And then over the rest of this chapter, we're essentially going to go through every single endocrine gland, its hormones, and what those hormones do. And by the end, pretty much everything that's on this flowchart, you will know. But we're not going to do this flowchart all at once like I've done here. We're going to break this down into like individual glands, but I am going to keep referencing this giant flowchart as we go through here. Okay, so let's get into it. So we're going to start today by talking about the hypothalamus and the pituitary, both in the brain. The hypothalamus, as we talked about, is kind of the control center for the endocrine system. So that's kind of why we're starting there. So we're going to describe what the hypothalamus does, what the pituitary gland does, and what hormones are produced by both the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary, and what all those different hormones do. So the pituitary gland is a gland that both stores and produces hormones. There are two different lobes of the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus does produce some of its own hormones, and those hormones are then transferred to the posterior pituitary to be stored. And then the anterior pituitary, which is the other lobe of the pituitary, makes its own hormone. And then the hypothalamus releases hormones that are called releasing factors, and they stimulate the pituitary gland to release its own hormones. Many of the hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary gland are called tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are just hormones that stimulate other endocrine glands, as opposed to like muscles or something. So when the hypothalamus secretes a releasing hormone, it's going to go to the anterior pituitary gland. Depending on the type of releasing hormone, that is going to determine what hormone is then released by the anterior pituitary. That hormone gets released into the bloodstream, where it'll travel through the blood and then hit the target gland. The target gland is then going to release its own hormone or do something else to affect a change in the body. These systems are all controlled by a negative feedback loop. So if like the product of this kind of chain of reactions, if that final product builds up, it will inhibit the release of releasing hormone, and it will stop this whole process. So up here in the brain, this little teardrop shaped thing is the pituitary gland, and then right above that we have the hypothalamus. If you kind of zoom in on that pituitary gland, whoopsies, zoom in on the pituitary gland, you can see that there are two different lobes. The anterior pituitary, that's the section that produces its own hormones. The posterior pituitary gets its hormones from the hypothalamus, so the hypothalamus would make the hormones, and then the hormones would go down through this stalk to be stored in the posterior pituitary. And then anytime hormones need to be released from either lobe of the pituitary, the hypothalamus would send a releasing hormone through the bloodstream to trigger the pituitary gland to release a specific hormone. So the hypothalamus is responsible for monitoring the internal environment of your body and maintaining homeostasis. And it does that by essentially controlling the release of all of these different hormones in the body. Inside the hypothalamus, there is a set of cells called neurosecretory cells. And those are the cells of the hypothalamus that actually make hormones. And then those hormones go to the posterior pituitary to be stored. And those two hormones that are made in the hypothalamus and then stored in the posterior pituitary are ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which we've already talked about, and oxytocin. And then there's another group of neurosecretory cells also in the hypothalamus that make like the releasing hormones that would stimulate the lobes of the pituitary to release their hormones. Okay, so we're now going to go through the two hormones that are made in the hypothalamus, stored and secreted from the posterior pituitary. So the first is ADH, antidiuretic hormone, so made in the hypothalamus by the neurosecretory cells, sent to the pituitary. So the ADH is stored in the posterior pituitary until the hypothalamus tells it that it needs to be released. ADH, its main job is to decrease urine output and conserve water in the body. So we've talked about ADH before, but just a little reminder, in the brain there are osmoreceptors which detect the osmotic pressure of your blood. And what will happen is if the osmotic pressure of your blood gets too high, those osmoreceptors shrink up. That is going to signal to your hypothalamus that something needs to be done about the osmotic pressure. Then a signal is going to be sent to the posterior pituitary to release the ADH. The ADH then goes into the kidneys, where it goes to the nephrons of the kidneys and causes them to become more permeable to water. So water is going to leave the kidneys, go back into the blood. That is going to increase your blood pressure, decrease the osmotic pressure, also means that you're going to pee less and that your urine will be concentrated. And then once the osmotic pressure is back to normal, the hypothalamus will detect that again because of the osmoreceptors, and it will stop telling the posterior pituitary to release ADH. The ADH also makes a person thirsty so that they'll drink more water, which again will go into the bloodstream and decrease the osmotic pressure. Yeah, that's really it. There is such thing as abnormal ADH responses if the posterior pituitary doesn't secrete enough ADH, or if the kidney's nephrons just don't respond to the ADH properly. That could be diabetes insipidus, so we've talked about that before as well, where the patient urinates a lot of dilute urine and is always thirsty. Alcohol consumption also inhibits the release of ADH, which can result in more water loss. People have to pee all the time when they drink a lot. The other thing I do want to briefly talk about is the release of ADH from the posterior pituitary is stimulated by the hypothalamus, but it comes in the form of a nerve signal. So the hypothalamus sends a nerve impulse to the posterior pituitary, telling it to release the ADH. Okay, then we get to oxytocin. This is also a hormone made in the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin then goes on to muscle cells, both in the uterus and around the milk glands in the breasts, and it causes those muscles to contract. That's what causes like uterine contractions during childbirth, also helps with lactation. Okay, so that's it for the posterior pituitary. Then we get to the anterior pituitary, which makes its own hormones, including tropic hormones, also called tropins. Again, those tropins are just hormones that go to another endocrine gland. So for example, ADH goes to the kidney. The kidney is not an endocrine gland, therefore ADH is not a tropic hormone. Same with oxytocin. Oxytocin goes to your muscles. So that is not a tropic hormone because it's not going to an endocrine gland. Unlike with the posterior pituitary, when we're dealing with the anterior pituitary, the hypothalamus is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release its hormones by using its own hormones. So the hypothalamus The hypothalamus secretes releasing factors, which is a type of hormone. That releasing factor hormone goes to the anterior pituitary and causes the anterior pituitary to release its own hormone. These are all of the different hormones of the anterior pituitary. So we have thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and human growth hormone. And of these hormones, the first 4 are all tropic hormones. The last 2 are not. So thyroid stimulating hormone, also called TSH, it is a tropic hormone because it is going to go to the thyroid gland. As the name suggests, it is going to stimulate the thyroid gland. It causes an increased production of thyroxine, which is one of the thyroid gland's hormones. Thyroxine increases metabolism and regulates growth. We're going to talk more about thyroxine in a later lesson. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, called ACTH for short, it is also a tropic hormone. It is going to, as the name suggests, stimulate the adrenal cortex. That's what the adrenal cortex, and it's a tropic hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So the adrenal cortex is the outside of the adrenal gland. ACTH is going to cause hormones called glucocorticoids to be released from the adrenal cortex. Those glucocorticoids are a type of steroid hormone that helps regulate blood glucose and water balance. And we're going to talk about those more later as well. Then we have our follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and our luteinizing hormone. These are also tropic hormones because they stimulate the gonads. Sometimes they are called gonadotropins. They are tropins that stimulate the gonads. So what happens is the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone goes to the anterior pituitary and causes the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. Both FSH and LH are found in both males and females. They go to the testes and ovaries. FSH causes the production of sperm in males and the production of eggs and estrogen in females. LH causes the production of testosterone in males, and in females, it causes ovulation, which is the release of the egg from the ovary, as well as the production of progesterone and the formation of something called the corpus luteum, which we'll talk about in the next unit. Then we get to prolactin, which is a non-tropic hormone. Prolactin targets the mammary glands. Mammary glands are exocrine, though they're not endocrine. Prolactin is secreted near the end of pregnancy, and it causes milk production in order for lactation to be able to happen. And then lastly, we have human growth hormone, which affects most cells in the body. It's also not tropic. It causes the skeleton to elongate during growth. It causes the cells of soft tissue and bone to increase in size and number, so you get more cells and the cells are bigger. It also causes more muscle cells and connective tissues to grow. It promotes protein synthesis, so your body's making more proteins that can then be used for muscle building, for instance. It also inhibits the breakdown of protein. It does promote the breakdown of fat, which then increases the level of fatty acids in the blood and decreases the amount of fat stored. Muscles can then use that fatty acid as an energy source, which is important because normally muscles would use glucose as an energy source. But when a kid is growing, their brain needs a lot of energy, and the brain can only use glucose as its energy source. So essentially the muscles at this point, when human growth hormone is working, the muscles don't use the glucose, they save that for the brain, and the muscles switch over to using fatty acids as an energy source. And then, yeah, that's just kind of like what normally happens during childhood, anytime you're having like a growth spurt. However, if a person has too much HGH during their childhood, it can result in gigantism. If they have too little, it can result in dwarfism. Okay, let me switch over to my document cam now. Okay, so this is part of that giant flow chart. At the very top of the flow chart here, you can see I have the hypothalamus, and a lot of the arrows here kind of start at the hypothalamus and then go elsewhere, because the hypothalamus is in charge of a lot of the endocrine system. But anyway, today we're focusing on just the pituitary portion of this. So the posterior pituitary makes oxytocin and ADH. If we're talking about oxytocin, the hypothalamus is going to send a signal to the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Oxytocin then, and I realize this is probably very difficult to see, oxytocin then causes the uterine muscles and the milk gland muscles to contract. With ADH, what happens is the osmotic pressure increases. That is detected by the osmoreceptors. These shrinking osmoreceptors are going to trigger the hypothalamus to send an impulse to the posterior pituitary to release the ADH. The ADH then goes to the nephron tubules of the kidney. It increases their water permeability, so more water is reabsorbed into the blood. That is going to decrease osmotic pressure, which is then detected by the osmoreceptors. And I do have written here on this line that connects the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary that from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary, you also have hormones that are made in the hypothalamus being sent down via the stalk. So remember, the posterior pituitary hormones are made in the hypothalamus, stored and secreted from the posterior pituitary. Then we have our anterior pituitary, which makes HGH, prolactin, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. Again, the hypothalamus is in charge of all of these being secreted. So the hypothalamus sends down its releasing hormones to the anterior pituitary. Some of these releasing hormones you need to know the specific name of. So for example, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, stimulates the secretion of our gonadotropins, LH and FSH. Thyroid releasing hormone, TRH, causes the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Those are the two that you really need to know. So anyway, all of this starts off with the hypothalamus sending a releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary. And then the anterior pituitary, depending on the releasing hormone, will release one of these hormones. So HGH causes the growth of skeletal muscles, bone, and soft tissue. It also causes protein synthesis. It also causes the fats to break down, which produces fatty acids, which is used for energy instead of glucose, which causes the blood glucose to increase, and then that glucose is used by the brain. We also have prolactin, which goes to the mammary glands and causes milk production. Just a reminder, these two hormones, HGH and prolactin, are the only two from the anterior pituitary that are not tropic. And then we have our gonadotropins, LH and FSH. LH in females is going to cause ovulation. I realize that's still really hard to read. Ovulation, the corpus luteum to form, which then causes progesterone to be made. And then in men, it's going to cause testosterone production. FSH will go to the ovaries to cause the production of estrogen and also eggs to develop. It'll go to the testes in men to cause sperm production. And then we also have the anterior pituitary releasing ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And if we follow that over, I zoom out again for a second. So the anterior pituitary releases act H. That act H then goes over to the adrenal cortex. And we're going to talk more about the adrenal glands in a later lesson. But act H goes to the adrenal cortex. That is why it's a tropic hormone. And then lastly, again, from the hypothalamus, thyroid releasing hormone comes to the anterior pituitary, causes the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, which, as the name suggests, goes to the thyroid, and it's going to cause the thyroid to produce more T3 and T4, which again, we'll talk about in our lesson on the thyroid. Okay. Please let me know if you have any questions about this stuff. But yeah, for now, it's just kind of, you know, this part of the flow chart that you should be familiar with. And then also the fact that this line is going to the thyroid and that's going to the adrenal cortex. Okay. Yeah, next up, we'll be doing kind of the rest of this in like 3 more lessons.